Good evening, scholars. We're going to spend some time today discussing Japanese-American internment during World War II. The thing I want to start with is the Munson Report. The report was prepared by Curtis B. Munson, an employee of the U.S. State Department. Munson had been investigating the loyalty of Japanese immigrants and Japanese-American citizens living along the eastern seaboard. Munson's report details his findings, which suggest that there is no threat to the United States from these individuals. In fact, he says there is no Japanese problem on the coast. There is far more danger from communists on the coast than there is from the Japanese. If you care to notice the dates at the top of the Munson Report, you can see that it was prepared before the Japanese attacks at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. In fact, President Roosevelt had this report in his hands by at least November 7th, 1941. So you may be asking yourselves, why was the U.S. investigating Japanese Americans prior to these attacks at Pearl Harbor? Well, that's a very complicated question. A possible contributor to these investigations into Japanese American citizens could be long-term anti-Japanese immigrant sentiments in the United States that have really existed since the 1850s. That's a little bit outside of the scope of our analysis here, but it is something interesting to look into. More likely, a more probable cause for this investigation would be global affairs. We know that the war begins in East Asia in 1931 with the Mukden incident precipitated by Japanese nationalists. We know that by 1937 the Japanese had invaded China. They were well established in Nanking and really looked to be progressing quite successfully with their war effort. So the United States would obviously have operatives investigating and keeping an eye on these global affairs and wondering how they might be impacting the U.S. The impact of these global affairs would become abundantly clear on the night of December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese staged a surprise attack against the United States, focusing mainly on the naval base at Pearl Harbor. What you see pictured here is the USS Arizona. FDR describes December 7th, 1941 as a date which will live in infamy, a day that Americans will never forget, a day that has an irrefutable impact on our national history and our national consciousness, our national interpretation of self and of the world. No longer could the United States sit on the sidelines and embrace this idea of isolationism, this idea that the rest of the world can have their problems and we as observers or occasional participants can just watch from the sidelines. That's not acceptable anymore. The U.S. is thrust headlong, headfirst into this fight of World War II. I'm going to make a bit of a comparison here, largely for the sake of illustrative purposes, not that I'm saying these two events are tremendously similar, but there are some similarities, especially in the impact upon the public, between the attack at Pearl Harbor and the attack on the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. Thinking back to 1941, there hadn't been any major attacks on the United States since, let's say, 1814. Okay. This attack came out of the blue, it was unexpected, it was devastating, many American lives are lost, and it becomes a rallying point, something that stirs patriotism, something that results in a massive influx of young men and young women signing up for the military or military service-related jobs. Along with a surge in patriotism after the attacks at Pearl Harbor, there's also a surge in national paranoia. People genuinely fear that individuals with any sort of connection to the Empire of Japan may potentially be a threat to the safety and security of the United States and her citizens. Despite the findings of the Munson Report just 1 month before the attacks, President Roosevelt responds to the fear and anxiety of the American public with Executive Order 9066. At first glance, this executive order seems fairly harmless. Its stated goal is protection against espionage and against sabotage to national defense materials, premises, and utilities. Unfortunately, this order did cause significant problems for the people impacted by it, namely Japanese Americans. Essentially, what this act calls for is the creation of military zones or military areas set aside specifically for the management or control of military commanders who get to determine who enters, who stays, who leaves these zones. So in effect, what it does is allow for the creation of internment camps throughout the United States. Primarily, these camps are filled by Japanese Americans or Japanese immigrants. On a much smaller scale, it also impacts German immigrants and German Americans, but it's only something like 10,000 German Americans who are impacted. Just on numbers alone, it's primarily targeting Japanese American citizens. We see here this map that details where Japanese internment camps were located. Please note that there are 2 internment camps in southeast Arkansas, one at Rower and one at Jerome. There's not much left of these today. You can go visit them, but mainly what you'll see there are reconstructions and photos from the original camp. A lot of the original structures were destroyed. You'll note here along the west coast, there's an exclusion area. Primarily what you see here are assembly centers, like meeting points, before the internees were shipped east. Primary reason for that is to remove potential threats from the coast. The government wanted to make it exceedingly difficult for Japanese Americans to reach out to Japan if they happen to be enemy operatives, and also to make it difficult for assistance to come in from Japan. I've actually never stumbled across any accounts of Japanese Americans offering assistance to Japan. They may be out there, but I'm not familiar with any if they are. We spent some time looking at images from internment camps. The one we see here is Camp Manzanar. Let's look back at the map and see where that's located. So this one is in California. All right, Camp Manzanar, this would be in the desert. As you can tell from the image, it's not a very pleasant place to be, very isolated. We see the mountains there in the background, very dry, very dusty. What I think is pretty striking about this image and very unique is the American flag still flying in the center of the camp. From most of the accounts we've been exploring, we really don't get a sense of hatred or anger from Japanese Americans who are interred, even though they're uprooted from their lives, from their businesses, from their schools, literally from their homes. Think back to the TEDx talk we saw with George Takei. The title of that talk was Why I Love a Country That Betrayed Me. And we see George Takei explaining that, despite all these hardships he faced, he and his family being interred at a camp, actually in Arkansas, that he still feels a sense of patriotism and a sense of pride in being an American. Takei also delves into the wartime experiences of the 442nd, which was an Army corps or unit, I guess, composed entirely of Japanese American soldiers. So their exploits are. Within this TED Talk, Takei also shares the story of the 442nd Regimental Infantry Unit, which we see here. This was a fighting corps composed entirely of Japanese American citizens. The young men who signed up for this unit, many had been interred, or their families were still interred as they were sent to fight for their country in Europe. So Takei's short explanation of their heroism in Europe, I would suggest again that you check out Takei's TED Talk Why I Love a Country That Betrayed Me to hear more both about Takei's experience with internment and about the fighting for 42nd. Choosing to enlist in the U.S. Army for service overseas was one method available to Japanese American men to get themselves out of an internment camp. However, it was not a very popular option. Only about 1,200 men took the government up on that offer. Ultimately, the last internment camp is closed in 1945, and Japanese Americans are really just sent off to try and rebuild their lives. They went back home to find that their jobs were gone, their homes maybe were no longer available to them. It was really just starting over from the ground up. And for many people who were middle-aged or older, who had spent their lives trying to build up careers and trying to build up sort of a nest egg for their family, had to begin again as if they were starting over entirely. I want to end our discussion today with Korematsu versus the United States. There are some interesting details to this case, but just know that in 1944, a Japanese American man tried to sue the United States government, saying that Executive Order 9066 and all things pertaining to it were unconstitutional and illegal. He argues his case, but the court rules in favor of the United States government and says that this sort of expulsion, this sort of casting out and isolating of a certain group of people is actually constitutionally acceptable in situations of emergency and peril. As you can understand, that might cause a bit of a slippery slope argument, especially when anything, what does he mean by emergency and peril? What sort of standard would you have to meet nationally to be able to determine a feeling of emergency and peril? Korematsu, after this ruling, spends a significant amount of time, essentially most of the rest of his life, trying to get this decision overturned, trying to get reparations or apologies for Japanese Americans who had been interred. Eventually, finally, in 1988, the United States government issues an apology to the individuals who were interred, an official apology, and by 1989, Congress starts issuing payments to people who were interred of $20,000 each. $20,000 each. So over, 40 years after the internment, only $20,000 for completely uprooted, completely destroyed lives. Many of the people who were interred were no longer alive to receive these payments, and it's really hard to put a price on someone's life, on their home, on their sense of security within their country. I suppose it's better than nothing, but really, it's not enough. And I don't think it could ever be enough. Okay. So, I hope this was a useful review for you, and I hope it serves you well, scholars, as you prepare for your test this week. Good luck, Godspeed, and please let me know if you have questions or need extra help.